During the summers of 2005 and 2006, scientists went to northern Quebec at the request of Hydro-Québec to carry out an uncommon mission. Their goal was to monitor the greenhouse gases produced by hydroelectric reservoirs and to measure the impact they have on a highly problematic phenomenon, climate change. We are in northern Quebec, beyond the 52nd parallel, at the latitude of James Bay. In this boreal region of lakes, rivers, and forests, an ambitious scientific investigation is taking place. For the very first time, scientists will try to ascertain whether boreal hydroelectric reservoirs contribute to global warming through greenhouse gas emissions, or if they can be incorporated into a sustainable development policy. Greenhouse gases occur naturally in the environment. They come from the oceans, vegetation, and the ground, or are found stored within the ground. By trapping the heat of the sun reflected by the Earth, much like a greenhouse, they keep the temperature of the planet at an average of 15 degrees Celsius. If it were not for natural greenhouse gases, global temperatures would average minus 18 degrees Celsius. Until the Industrial Revolution, the concentration of greenhouse gases remained constant because a natural cycle maintained a balance between the gases that flowed in and out of the atmosphere. Thus, the average temperature remained constant for thousands of years. However, today human activity is a major factor in the increase of the quantity of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Since we use fossil fuels to heat, cool, and power our homes and offices, fuel our vehicles, and operate our industries. Oil, coal, and natural gas, but also activities such as cattle breeding and landfills produce emissions that contribute to the increase in global temperatures and threaten our climate. The natural carbon cycle maintained a balance between the gases that were absorbed and those that were released, but it has been disrupted. The volume of greenhouse gas emissions is such that nature can no longer absorb it all. Each and every type of energy production generates greenhouse gases in one manner or another, but there are huge variations in the quantities produced. By comparing different sources of energy, it becomes clear that fossil fuel-based energy production generates large quantities of greenhouse gases. Fortunately, in Quebec, where there are only 4 large power plants, 1 nuclear power station, and windmills, 97% of the electricity produced comes from a renewable source, hydroelectricity. Over a 100-year cycle from the day a hydroelectric power plant is built to the moment it is dismantled at the end of its operational life, hydroelectricity produces very little greenhouse gases. But, one may ask, how much is very little? That is the question that this large-scale field survey aims to answer. The construction by Hydro-Québec of a new power plant on the Eastmain River provided the opportunity to launch this research in which Quebec universities and dozens of scientists from various disciplines all take part. This is the first time that the greenhouse gas emissions produced by hydroelectric reservoir will be closely measured at its very inception. Basically, the project measures the quantities of gas produced before and after the creation of the reservoir. In other words, it will compare the levels of gas produced by nature with those that are the result of human activities. For more than 10 years, Hydro-Québec and its partners have monitored the gross amounts of greenhouse gases coming from its installations, in other words, above the reservoirs. So far, research indicates that hydroelectric reservoirs produce greenhouse gases in small quantities and for a short period only, less than 10 years. Yet this makes comparisons between different energy production modes a difficult undertaking, since these results are not a measurement of the net quantities of greenhouse gases produced by reservoirs, because these researchers do not monitor greenhouse gases before and after the reservoirs were built. Hence, the relevance of this great field investigation. Throughout the summer of 2005, teams of researchers took samples and performed extensive analysis on the area where the reservoir would be located, as well as adjoining regions, within a radius of approximately 20 kilometers. Scientists returned in the summer of 2006 to measure the effects of the creation of the reservoir in the designated flood area. Using all the required scientific instruments and apparatus, they monitored the aquatic and terrestrial environments as well as wetlands. In other words, they examined the water of lakes and rivers, soil of the forests, and peat bogs, which is quite a task in such a remote area, where one is far more likely to meet a bear than a human being. Three teams were deployed for the land part of the study. The first team took core samples in peat bogs in order to measure the carbon they contained. Another team measured gas emissions from the surface of the peat bogs, while a third performed analysis in the forest areas. Let us begin with the peat bogs, since they are reputed to contain the most greenhouse gases. These expanses of compact vegetation saturated with water are of particular interest to scientists because they contain important quantities of carbon, which causes them to produce large quantities of greenhouse gases. Peat bogs cover approximately 15% of northern Quebec. At Eastmain, a team of scientists focuses on identifying the effects of flooding on peat bogs. Luke, Catherine, Caroline, and their colleagues arrive with the instruments they will use to examine the area.
We are here in a peat bog, an environment that naturally produces and absorbs greenhouse gases. We're taking measurements to find out how much gases the peat bog releases and absorbs, and then we'll be able to compare these measurements with those made above peat bogs that have been submerged.
This is a peat bog located in the Great Bypass created for the future Eastmain-1 reservoir, and we are doing core sampling by driving a tube into the ground about 3 meters down. As we go beyond the surface and deeper down, this will allow us to study the environmental condition up to a few thousand years ago.
What we have here is live peat moss, or sphagnum, that grows on the bog. Right underneath the surface, we'll find sphagnum that is a little older, maybe a few years old, and which has hardly started to decompose. If we go a bit deeper, we'll find organic matter in a much more advanced state of decomposition, and that will be more than 10 years old. In this core sample, we have a matter that is a few hundred years old. We'll have to use carbon-14 dating to find out how old the peat bog actually is.
Once we know more about the history of the peat bog, we'll have information about the climatic changes that occurred over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, and we can include this data in our models to predict climatic changes. One of the goals here is to understand how the peat bog evolves over the medium and long term so we can integrate this knowledge into the dynamics of a reservoir. One of the key aspects of a peat bog is that it's saturated with water, 100% water. When you walk around on it a little, you hear these suction noises because it's full of water. Therefore, we have no reason to believe that submerging a peat bog will make it decompose much faster, except perhaps for the surface grass, which will decompose easily and produce greenhouse gases. But as far as the rest of the organic matter is concerned, it should remain at the bottom of the reservoir as long as the reservoir exists.
In 2006, after the reservoir was built, although peat bogs represented only 15% of the flooded area, a few sections of peat bog rose to the surface. These small floating islands quickly disappeared under the effect of the waves and ice at the surface of the water. Michelle Garneau from the Department of Geography at UQAM.
Since peat bogs are major carbon sinks that are likely to become important sources of carbon in a context of climatic change, it is important to start defining more precisely how much carbon will be stored and how much can eventually seep out of these reservoirs.
Peat bogs represented but a portion of the territory to be investigated. We also had to study the waters and the forests. Forests, lakes, and rivers covered an area that had, over the years, accumulated more or less important quantities of carbon. In order to measure the quantity of greenhouse gas emitted in the forest zone, it was necessary to take into account each of its components. First, the soil, which comprises two main layers, the ground litter at the surface made up of identifiable organic matter from plants, and the mineral soil formed of black organic matter, which is no longer identifiable and is made up of coal and mineral carbon. Obviously, the forest also includes vegetation.
The key aspect to this project is to find out how much carbon has been accumulated in the live humus, and also to ascertain how much carbon and nitrogen there is in the zones located near the surface. Here we see organic matter, humus, and the surface is moss that has hardly started decomposing. But the deeper we go, the more decomposed it is. What is interesting here is that we have a zone about 1 centimeter thick that indicates that there was a forest fire, and underneath it we have another more reddish zone that tells us what type of organic matter the forest originally grew out of.
This entire environment naturally produces carbon dioxide, CO2, one of the major sources of greenhouse gases. At the same time, it absorbs part of the gases coming in from the atmosphere. This is what is known as the carbon cycle. There is another major source of natural greenhouse gases, forest fires. In a few hours, burning trees can release the equivalent of 1 century of the forest otherwise emitted greenhouse gases. Before the reservoir was flooded in 2005, measurements were also made of this factor in order to establish the levels of greenhouse gas emissions naturally occurring in the forest. For navigation purposes, a number of trees that were designated to be flooded were cut down and hauled out. In 2006, once the reservoir had been filled, the scientific team took measurements at several locations in the forest around the reservoir and above the reservoir. It was also necessary to assess the volumes of gas that the water produced. In the course of their natural cycle, Lakes and rivers produce greenhouse gases that are caused by the type of soil and by the decomposition of plants, which arrive into them through various watercourses and precipitations. In fact, since 2003, scientists have been collecting large quantities of data about greenhouse gases emitted by lakes and rivers in the area where the reservoir was to be created. For statistical comparison, they also took measurements in neighboring lakes and rivers. The researchers reviewed 3 types of aquatic environments: natural lakes, which were not impacted by the hydroelectric power project, lakes and watercourses, which were located in the reservoir area to be flooded, and the Opinaca Reservoir, an area that was modified 23 years ago and where it was estimated that the level of greenhouse gas emissions should be close to those that occur in natural environmental conditions, as explains Alain Tremblay, Environment Advisor at Hydro-Québec.
What makes a lake and a reservoir comparable? The measurements we've recorded and the environmental monitoring we've done over the last 25 years show that the parameters of a reservoir are similar to those of a natural lake, as far as water quality, planktons, phytoplankton, and fish are concerned. The natural system is disrupted when a reservoir is created, but after about 10 years, we have a lake according to all our parameters. Why does a reservoir release greenhouse gases? This has to do with one of the reservoir's major impacts being that when it is created, a portion of land is submerged. This means that the large quantities of organic matter will gradually decompose during the first 3 or 4 years. But after a 10-year period, the quantity of greenhouse gases that is released stabilizes at the same level as the lake or forest. Therefore, the reservoir effect, so to speak, only lasts 10 years after the submergence.
In 2006, once the reservoir had been completely filled, our scientists returned to take measurements and samples in the same areas. We can see them here using various precision instruments and apparatus, such as a floating chamber, which is used to estimate the quantity of gases produced at the surface of water, an automated measuring station set up to monitor the flow of gases from the reservoir, and a probe which was dipped into the water for real-time measurements of gas concentrations in the water. Whether it is a question of heliporting zodiacs from one lake to another, taking satellite pictures, or providing GPS locations, 21st century technologies and means of communication allow us to accomplish feats that would have been unthinkable only a few decades ago. We should bear in mind that not so long ago, only Crees and a few explorers traveled through these vast northern expanses. Despite their sophisticated paraphernalia, Luc and his colleagues often had to use their creativity and resourcefulness in order to adapt their technology to difficult northern conditions. Once Delphine and the other members of the scientific teams have taken their samples, they regroup in the laboratory that has been set up at the camp. Posted on the lab door, a picture of Indiana Jones seems to challenge these young boreal forest sleuthhounds, or rather, question them. What is all this stir? These scientists will tell you that their goal is to create a three-dimensional map of the reservoir in order to find out how much greenhouse gas it is releasing into the atmosphere through water evaporation and organic matter decomposition.
This is a major multidisciplinary research campaign with several components and different specialists for the aquatic environment, the terrestrial environment, and even the peat bog environment. It is also unique because this is the first time that we monitor greenhouse gases released immediately after the creation of a hydroelectric reservoir. We have measurements that were made before the flooding. We will integrate this data with the measurements made during the year immediately after the creation of the reservoir and the results of the monitoring of the natural environment around the reservoir. Then we'll really be able to calculate the global total quantity of greenhouse gases released by the natural environment and those released by the reservoir. What is exceptional is to have this data right after the flooding.
Thanks to this major scientific project sponsored by Hydro-Québec Production and by the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences, we know more about the conditions that support greenhouse gas formation and about the true environmental impact of hydroelectric reservoirs. Preliminary findings support the trends observed during the 10 years during which measurements were made of gross amounts of greenhouse gases. Those trends indicated that the hydroelectric reservoirs produce small amounts of greenhouse gases, and for a short period of time only. However, we will have to wait until the scientific investigation is completed before we have an overall assessment. In a perspective of sustainable development, a better understanding of the processes at hand will help us choose the way we produce energy in order to better preserve the subtle ecological balance of this region, as well as the natural equilibrium of our blue planet.